Okay, we're ready.
All right, thanks a lot. So it is 1:04 by my watch. I am calling the March 20th, 2023 meeting of the Albemarle County Architecture Review Board to order. Carolyn, could you call the roll, please?
Yes, Mr. Vanderwerf,
Here.
Mr. Stoner, Mr. Hancock,
Here.
Mr. Henningsen,
Here.
and Mr. Matsuno is also absent.
All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Today's meeting is a hybrid meeting. The public may access and participate in the meeting electronically. Instructions for doing so are posted on the Albemarle County website at the Albemarle County calendar. The public has real-time audiovisual access to this meeting over Zoom and real-time audio access over telephone. Both is provided in the lawfully posted meeting notice. This meeting is being recorded and will be made available on the county's website. This meeting is a public record and subject to disclosure under the Freedom of Information Act. All speakers, when it is your turn to speak, please first state your name for the record. Applicants who are making presentations, note that your presentation is limited to a total of 15 minutes, which you can divide among your team members. Carolyn will let us know when the 15 minutes are up. If applicants in the meeting room have team members attending virtually who will need to present, please make that known when you come to the podium. Everyone who is participating virtually, please mute your microphone until it is your turn to speak. Do any ARB members have anything to disclose? No. No. Okay, thank you. Carolyn, are there any members of the public that want to make a comment about a project that is not on the agenda for review?
No, not at this time.
All right, thank you. There are no consent agenda items today. So there's one regular review item today, which is ARB 2023-17 Seaville Rye Road Apartments. Chris, do you have the presentation ready?
Yes, 1 second. The application you're reviewing today is a proposal to construct 250 multifamily units in apartment buildings in addition to associated site improvements. This review represents the second review of the site plan and the first review of architecture. Site is located along Rye Road West, approximately 530 feet west of the intersection of Woodburn Road and Rye Road West. Architectural designs have been provided with this submittal. The overall design of the building types within this development are contemporary in style, but feature forms and building materials that reflect those used historically within the county. The elevations visible from the entrance corridor uses changes in roof form materials and colors to help break down the mass of the buildings. However, on the sides of buildings 1 through 4 and 6 are structures that are either utilitarian in appearance or treatments that are not appropriate for the entrance corridor facing elevations. Notably, the structures that are to house utilities and equipments in the false windows. Revising these elevations to relocate or revise the design of the equipment and utility structures and removing the bay of false windows would be appropriate. A landscape plan has also been provided with the submittal. The plan appears to show large shade trees with ornamental trees interspersed, but the species have not been keyed on the plan. The spacing of large shade trees exceed 35 feet in a few locations. And of the trees shown in the schedule, none of the caliber sizes meet the frontage requirement. The site plan will need to be revised to key the proposed species on the plan and shade trees at 3.5-inch caliber. Regarding landscape in the interior and perimeters of the site, due to the layout of the site, the interior parking area trees double as pedestrian way trees. 38 interior parking trees have been provided. However, many are likely spaced too close together for healthy tree growth. They are not evenly distributed and they do not meet the required caliber size. Along the perimeters of the site, it appears that shrubs instead of large trees are shown. Staff recommends that the landscape plan be revised to show interior and perimeter trees at 2.5-inch caliber and a more even distribution of interior trees throughout the site. Staff recommends approval of the final site plan with the revisions listed in the staff report. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thanks a lot, Chris. Frank, do you have any questions for staff?
I don't. Thanks, Chris.
Dave, do you have any?
I don't either. Thank you, Chris.
All right, thanks. I don't have any questions either. Is the applicant ready with a presentation?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Scott Collins. I'm civil engineer working with the developer on this project. We also have in attendance the architect team for the project and the landscape architect as well for the project. So we have a bunch of people here. We can definitely kind of walk through some different things, talk about some stuff, and really kind of get into everything with the whole team here. So I'm going to start off by kind of talking a little bit about where we are and how we got here, and then let the architects and landscape architects really kind of get into the nuts and bolts of some of the aspects, because certainly that's probably more of the discussion today. So this is a apartment project that went through the rezoning process, and during that we worked really a lot with Margaret and her team and Chris and everybody about how to properly design this site, knowing that Raya Road was definitely going to be intricate design as one of the aspects. We wanted to make sure we had all the units sort of fronting on Raya Road, but also positioned well enough so that they can also not only create the entrance into the site, but also have enough room to integrate landscaping with all the utilities along the front. And I kind of created a colorized version of the site plan, just kind of show you a little bit of what we were up against. The biggest thing is what's kind of outlined in red right there was sort of all the utilities out there, whether it's overhead or underground, from underground utilities from some of the VDOT relocation projects. They had a lot of the frontage was sort of incorporated with easements. And so that kind of sort of dictated how those buildings were going to be fronting on that street. And we really wanted to make sure that they fit in well. The other challenge about the site is about a 40-foot elevation change from Raya Road down to sort of the stream that kind of cuts through sort of the southwest corner of the site. And the site's not that deep. So, we went through a lot of thoughts and designs about maybe having the buildings up front with a small retaining wall that stepped the site down a little bit. We're talking about 3 feet or so, but working with Margaret and her staff, she figured that wasn't the best option for this. So we kind of eliminated that, because that would also sort of have some effect on the landscaping that we could do in the frontage of those units. But we set the project up so that those units along Raya Road would also be 3 stories in height. And as you get back into the site, as it steps down, that's where we get the 4 and 5 story units kind of. So it didn't overwhelm Raya Road, knowing that there is still a lot of residential type style houses along that corridor, that part of the corridor. So we wanted to be cognizant of that. So I think we worked pretty well, and we set up a site that with a lot of the ARB aspects sort of taken into account during the rezoning. And we really, like I said, we really kind of focused on that. And I think that's probably why hopefully there's not a whole lot of site related aspects. Now it's more or less tying in the architecture of the buildings and the landscaping around it to get that to adhere to Raya Road and to the ARB guidelines and make sure everything's sort of cohesive and working together. And at this point, I'll turn it over to the architecture team, and they can kind of talk a little bit more about the buildings and about some of the comments as they relate to the project. And I think yes, there you go.
Good afternoon. Thank you again for taking the time to meet with us today. My name is Nicholas Giederman. I'm with Hefner Architects. We are the firm that designed the buildings you see before you. And kind of building off of what Scott said, what we've been working through on this project for the last several months is to try to find a architectural vocabulary that can be grounded in a neighborhood that's as established as Rio Road, but also larger, context for greater Charlottesville itself. And, as was noted in the staff report, it is very much a building of the 21st century. It's not pretending to be something that it's not. It has a rather, cool, expressive palette, but it is built of a kit of parts that are kind of indelibly vernacular residential, lining Rio Road with 3-story, again, keeping generally at a scale, rhythm, and height that's in keeping character with a typical residential neighborhood. That we're working to, orient, some vertical mix and match vertical and horizontal elements to break up the masses of the buildings while still giving a sort of general rhythm that again expresses a residential character, something that you might see in a bay window or in a row of townhomes. I don't think that there's anything here that's particularly wildly out of character for what we both are building, but also the neighborhood in which we are building. Then again, working with the site plan to kind of step back off of Rio Road before the buildings get any taller, and really just striving to live some expression of individual dwelling units while still yielding a more cohesive whole, really to keep the building from erring on the side of too busy, keeping it kind of grounded both in the site and in the community. And like I said, working with a lot of kind of vernacular elements of alternating horizontal and horizontal lap and vertical board and batten siding. These sort of just classic look, 6 and 12, 12 and 12 pitched roofs, a few shed dormers here and there. We're not so modern or contemporary where we start moving into flat roofs. Again, we're still keeping the classic materials and palette of shingle, lap, sashed windows. I don't think there's anything particularly alien or foreign in this vocabulary. And really letting the buildings both frame the street externally along Rio, but give a sense of definition to the community itself. I think that there's a good deal of variety within the palette that allows each of the buildings to begin to express themselves, which I think on a kind of base, most functional level, really aids with wayfinding. Around the site, we like to think of our, 250 residents coming in, being able to identify where they are within the site, but also kind of on a broader scale that, we hope to avoid complete uniformity of building 7 of the exact same building with the exact same paints and finishes, but without getting, again, so staccato and random that the site no longer makes sense as a whole. So I think we've definitely worked to balance that, both building to building and using that to break up some of the longer elevations. So again, as we work our way around the site, you'll see that we start to step up in building height as grade begins to step down from Rio Road. And again, giving a sense of what comes next, that there's a good deal of depth and activity within this community, and that you should to come in and explore and give a real sense of place on the inward facing elevations, just as much as there's a sense of definition on the outward facing elevations. And again, I think this is a great example of watching our buildings kind of step up the hill and still really kind of work with that overall vernacular vocabulary of pitched roofs, shingle roofs, but doing it in a somewhat more, playful and contemporary way of building out these frames and, letting the buildings kind of break down while still reading as a more cohesive whole without just reading as an assemblage of parts. So this was the material board as we submitted. I I believe that the physical samples might give a better illustration of the kind of contrast that we're looking at. I think that we're taking great steps to avoid delivering a completely monochromatic building. I think that there is good contrast and variety in what we're proposing. And that's not just coming from color. I think that texture is a great tool in our toolkit. And whether that's alternating exposures between 4 and 8 inch lap siding, if that's working with solid panel, working with vertical board and batten, or these sort of built out frames that even within one plane, without making the building too busy, can give a sense of shadow and definition and just sort of subtle articulation, really on all 4 sides of the structures. So I think that's the end of our elevations, unless you'd like to work through building by building.
I guess we could do a building by building, if we get to that in, questions or discussions. But thanks for that overview. We'll go into questions now. Dave, do you have any questions for the applicant?
Sure. Thank you, Chris, and thank you for your presentation. Appreciate the attention that you all have given to breaking down the scale, especially on the corridor facing elevations. Well, I guess one question I had, looking at it, I think for me, it breaks down a little bit at the end where the gable expresses the entire width of the building. Is there any thought or strategy you've given to how that might be mitigated in the architecture?
Yes, and maybe it would be more helpful if I went back to the perspectives. I think that there certainly is a in elevation, we're experiencing the building kind of on the screen right now, the way that we wouldn't necessarily experience it at eye level. That we have in, kind of perspective vision, that it may not feel quite so heavy as it is now. But I mean, honestly, I left the buildings as presented with the idea that ultimately the roof is the sort of ultimate binding feature of this kit of parts. And one of my fears is that if we break it down too small, that we start to get this almost frenetic, overly busy and out of character kind of assemblage of parts. So we have kind of used the roof as a unifying tool. But I get what you're saying is that, in the side elevations at that rather broad 6 and 12, that it can seem somewhat wide and flat.
Yeah, and it may be good just to go back to the perspective. And I appreciate your point about the unity of the roof. I just wanted to ask if you had given it some consideration, because I think, I'm aware of the tension you're feeling about being too frenetic, but I feel like the success you've got in the rhythm and the scale that's happening along the entrance corridor, at least for me, it may be the prior one to this. And I apologize, mixing comment with question. I guess the other question I would have is you talked about the variety that you're trying to create in the complex, maybe even just looking at the site plan. Could you talk a little bit about what, I realize there's variety in the gable forms, well, or at least the number and orientation in the buildings. In terms of the palette, do you anticipate the palette varying between them, or will it be uniform across the complex?
I think that we're going to see one palette that gets deployed in a variety of ways. So we might have, a particular tone of gray that is our board and batten on one building and becomes our lap siding on another. And again, that's where we kind of get into texture and shadow lines and, southern exposure with lots of sun, and really working with one palette across all 7 buildings, but variety within each building. Again, so that there's a sense of placemaking, and also just to kind of break up the oppressive uniformity of having 7 carbon copies of the same building. So again, that may not be, it might be subtle, but I think, that we kind of see within this image where, the building on the left where we have sort of a dark gray frame with light gray infill, and on the right, it becomes a dark gray frame with white vertical siding. It's we're going to see the same materials and the same colors, but deployed in different relationships throughout the site.
Okay, thank you. The last question is, is this rendering accurate in terms of the darkness and the value that you project in the palette?
I think that from a trim and fascia standpoint, yes. There might be some room for discussion on just how dark the gray field and that sort of wraparound corner bay winds up becoming. But I would say generally this is accounting for, screen color and renderer's eye. This is generally the palette we would expect. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt, but there are actual physical samples back.
Okay, good. Okay, we'll take a look at those.
All right, thanks, Dave. Frank, do you have any questions for the applicants?
Yes, thank you for your presentation. For the site and the building. It's very, I think, very thoughtful in how you presented it. I mean, the project as a whole. I just had one question about the condensing units. And my apologies, I didn't maybe review it thoroughly enough. Are there any instances where those face the corridor, or are they all like on the backside of units?
They've all been designed to be inward facing.
Okay.
So they should not be facing the Rio Road itself. No.
Okay, thank you. And then maybe just help me understand how they're built. Just, I think I have an understanding, but just want to make sure.
Sorry, overshot it. So we have, and that's one of the reasons why we are using gables instead of hips, is even though that kind of opens us up to a somewhat higher end elevation that a hip might otherwise mitigate, it does leave us ample room to accommodate all of the dwelling units condensers within the roof wells. It's just geometry and math that we have to work with, but so that's where in the section, building 2, section number 3 on this sheet, that we have kind of countersunk a roof well basically on the back side of the gable. So what happens is between the roof well itself and then the guardrail height that we're building into the pitch of the 6 and 12 roof means that at no point from grade are you ever going to see a condenser unit. And essentially they are kind of, we call them bathtubs. It's a large opening within the gable, and we'll have, within it a TPO roof. And we've selected a kind of a dark siding, so that way it's not like a high contrast white within this black asphalt roof. So that's the thought process, that we would have kind of delicately screened within the roof structure itself. So it just sort of recedes into the background.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions.
So my questions just relate to 2 of the comments that were in the staff report. And I guess the first one would be the false windows. Could you talk a little bit more about what the specific treatment is at those false window?
I think right now, like we're seeing in view number 4 on this page, the thought was, and again, this is sort of the tension of marrying the needs of the interior with how the balance of the exterior. So rather than just having kind of a missing tooth within that gang of windows, the thought is that we would get essentially a solid panel in the same color as the field that surrounds it and trim it out as any other window. And I think that there certainly could be some other solutions to this conundrum. But that was our kind of first thought, was in order to maximize interior glazing, obviously avoid conflicts, that come with having a true blind window, that poses a number of waterproofing issues for us, that this sort of framed panel within siding was our sort of initial response to balancing the elevations, but respecting where we have interior walls behind.
All right, thanks. And my second question would be, and you can see on the north elevation that we're looking at on this sheet, that kind of mechanical, what I'll call shed, was identified on the staff report, and I thought it was a good point. It does look fairly utilitarian. I was wondering, this might be a comment more than a question, so we might put it off, but I guess, what was the rationale for having that be that?
I think the initial thought was to keep it small enough and dark enough. Again, much like with the roof wells, the idea that these kind of darker colors will start to recede in the background and work with landscaping to screen them as best we can. But I also think, as we've kind of established around the site, that we've kind of created a little series of rules for ourselves with the way that all these gable and shed roof bays and balconies and all of these this kit apart really kind of come together. So it might be an opportunity where it becomes something more than it is, and in doing so, then recedes into the background. That right now it might seem more glaring because it's dark siding in front of a field of light. That it could be an opportunity for a little more expression, and in doing so, blend better.
All right, thank you. Guess we'll go to see if there are any members of the public. Carolyn, are there any members of the public who would like to make a comment?
No, sir, not at this time.
All right, thanks a lot. We will now go into discussion. Frank Hancock, do you have any comments?
Sure. Overall, I think it's a really nice project and application. I think it has all the things we asked for. I think it's evident that you worked with staff kind of throughout the rezoning, kind of in the early planning process. And you're not trying to kind of fit a lot of these requirements of the guidelines in at site plan level. It was kind of, evident that you guys spent a lot of time on your site layout. So I appreciate that. I think the kind of limited color palette is nice. And I think with kind of all the architectural expressions, maybe variation, coupled with the kind of broken down, you don't have two massive facades, you have 4 buildings that front the corridor, I think is really nice. I think staff comments, what we asked the applicant about, I think would be the only things that would maybe be a concern. The windows, honestly, I don't know if the shed element, I don't know how much of an impact that will have on the corridor. But I think all in all, generally, I think it's a really nice application, and very thoughtful in how it was done, and great presentation too. It's always great to hear the thinking behind it. Sometimes we don't get that level of presentation, so I really appreciate that. Those are my comments.
All right, thanks, Frank. Dave, do you have any comments?
Sure. Well, I'll echo Frank's praise for the site plan and the organization. I think that appreciate the way the team, worked to work with the easements and staff and the setbacks. And I also do think it's very thoughtful in terms of how the palette is developed and deployed along the elevations facing the EC. I think, as I alluded to in my questions that were really comments, I think I do have concerns about the scale of the end elevations of the buildings and the way that those 60 some foot wide gable ends kind of defeat what I think is otherwise a very successful modulation of scale. And I think the palette, I'm a little concerned, at least from the visualizations I've seen, that it is perhaps, from my perspective, overly dark and brooding. And would appreciate consideration of ways to perhaps lighten it while still respecting the intent. And then I appreciate, Chris, you and staff raising the points about the utility structures and the windows, and would second those. But again, as Frank said, a very thoughtful application, and just a couple of concerns on my part to work out.
All right, thanks, Dave. I'm in agreement with my fellow board members. I thought it was a thoughtful project that kind of successfully addressed the guidelines and breaks up what the could be relatively large masses. Same with the site plan. Like it was well thought out and appropriate in general. I do agree with generally the comments that did appear in the staff report. The false windows, I don't know that they necessarily would need to be taken out, but I just think you can, it would be good to like take a closer look at that. Same with those utility areas as well, but all in all, I'd say it was a successful project and a good presentation. So I guess if there are no more comments, we'll look at the recommended motion.
So the recommendation is for approval with the conditions listed in the staff report. It looks like you all may want to discuss number 1 and number 2. And based on your comments, added 2 items at the end, consider lightening the color palette and consider revising the gable end to further minimize scale.
Guess my feeling is that condition number 1 is okay because it's relocate or revise in some way. And I guess reword the second condition to be similar. Maybe remove or revise the bay of false windows. Oh, sorry, Nab, maybe revise the design of the north elevation of building for it to remove or revise.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
I guess, Chris, to that point, do we want there to be no false windows in any case?
Yes, I'm just in my own experience, I've run into that situation where you have a rhythm that you're setting up and that doesn't necessarily marry well with the internal layout. So you want to do something and I've done that kind of false window. In this case, I don't know that just a flat panel that's trimmed out like a window is just looking at that, the rendering that particular treatment looked a little bit unsuccessful to me. As the applicant said, I think there are other ways to skin that cat. So I think it just, maybe another look at that particular situation.
Okay.
Other solution, but I don't think just taking them off is,
Oh, right, yeah. I was just thinking, do we want them to find a solution that's got real windows if possible? I guess that would be.
good option. Yeah, I think short of like completely revising the layout of the apartment. I didn't look too closely at the floor plans, but sometimes that's just not practical. Okay, well, would anyone
Well, and then I don't know if y'all are on board with 21 and 22. I would certainly support including those.
Dave, are you okay if those are considerations?
Yes, I mean, I think that is consistent with our discussion today.
Okay. I'm good with those.
yeah, me too. Thank you. All right, well, if there are no further comments, would anybody like to make a motion?
I'll move to approve the application with the conditions listed in the staff report amended as follows. Revise number 2 to add the words or revise. And add items number 21 and number 22.
I'll second the motion.
All right, thanks. Carolyn, can we put that to a vote?
Yes. Mr. Vanderwerf,
Aye.
Mr. Hancock,
Aye.
Mr. Henningsen.
Aye. All right, thanks a lot. We have 2 work sessions today. The first is on the comprehensive plan update.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Ben Holt. I'm with the Long Range Planning Team. So I'm going to give a quick overview of our comprehensive plan update. Okay. So the name of the project is AC 44, and we're updating our comprehensive plan. And as you probably know, the purpose of the plan, but it guides growth, development, and investment for the county over a 20-year vision. It's collaboration between community members, staff, and the county's elected and appointed officials. So the types of recommendations that are included in the plan, they guide how and where the county should grow, support of local business and industry, support of natural resources, multimodal transportation, and encouraging a variety of housing. Each plan topic includes goals, objectives, and strategy. And there's sort of at the top of the ladder is a goal. It's a high level vision. An objective is a specific outcome or target. And the strategy are the implementation steps to achieve those objectives. So what is AC 44? It stands for Albemarle County 2044. We're hoping the plan will be adopted in 2024, so that there's a 20-year duration of the plan. There's more information at the project website, and that's within the county's engagement site, engage.albemarle.org. Some of the reasons or some of the aims of the comprehensive plan, we want to update, reflect updated county's plans and policies. That includes recent initiatives like the Climate Action Plan, Project Enable, which is the Economic Development Plan, and Housing Albemarle. We also need to plan for projected population growth within the county and the associated demands that places on urban services and infrastructure. And I don't know if you've taken a look at our existing comprehensive plan. It's a pretty unwieldy document. So we're hoping to create a streamlined plan with improved usability and prioritization within that plan. We also need to align with new and updated state code criteria, and we're seeking to incorporate best practices from other jurisdictions in Virginia and around the country. So some of the recent initiatives to include are climate action, economic development, and multimodal transportation. We also want to ensure that equity is integrated into the plan because the county has now adopted community organizational value. And with this improved plan usability, we want to articulate prioritize goals. We also want to incorporate metrics so we can track how successfully we're meeting our objectives. And the document itself is going to be reduced and it's going to be more streamlined. So we're now conducting outreach. We're in phase 2 of 4 phases within this project. Specifically, we really want to get input from community members, especially those who have not historically been well represented, various ages, races, demographics. We want to also, during this plan update, implement a transparent community engagement process, allow everybody a chance to provide feedback and a variety of input options. So here's a timeline. We're at the beginning of phase 2. And within phase 1, we reviewed growth management options. Right now, we're looking at planning toolkits and draft policies. Last year in phase 1, the outcome of that, the major production or product from that was a framework for the rest of the plan. And we're calling that a framework for an equitable and resilient community. So these 4 big ideas for what we want the county to be in 20 years, a green and resilient community, welcoming and equitable, thriving and prosperous, connected and accessible. These ideas will shape the goals, objectives, and strategies of the new plan. And specifically, that's what we're going to get into discussion today are those goals and objectives. So the goals and objectives relate to plan topics such as transportation, land use, housing, economic development, parks and recreation, and resources, which includes natural, cultural, and historic, and also community facilities. So these planning toolkits, which I've mentioned that we're starting to develop right now, it's a way to coordinate land use and transportation and create these activity centers throughout the county, and provides guidance for form of development and incorporating multimodal transportation. There's 3 steps within the current phase 2. So step 1, discovering challenges and opportunities. We've posted some information to our website, made that available to the public about the various plans within the comp plan, or excuse me, topics within the comp plan. And we want to gauge the community's priorities for each of those subjects. The planning toolkits, we're starting to create a process right now and just creating a framework for how we're going to approach that, breaking down different areas of the county for potential to potentially place these different centers. And with the goals and objectives, we're incorporating that feedback from phase 1, and then we'll marry that with the feedback we get from this current phase. So we had an online questionnaire which just closed this past Friday. We've gotten really good engagement, over 500 responses so far, which we're really pleased with. We also just finished up a round of pop-ups. These were events where county staff went out into the public, various public locations like schools and libraries. We shared information about the comprehensive plan and information about the survey. Right now, we're still in the process of having community chats, and these are hosted meetings, public engagement meetings whereby people go out in the community and they host a conversation about these comprehensive plan topics. That's kind of being spearheaded by our appointed working group, which has had their first meeting and will have their second meeting to sort of review all the feedback that we're receiving in these community chats, which go through April 14th. So that brings us to the goals and objectives. So we've got a high level goal for the historic, cultural, and scenic resources. And those objectives include 11 objectives. I'm going to let Mariah go into those objectives in further detail, and we'll have some discussion so you all can share your thoughts about those objectives and how we might improve those for the updated version of the plan. Thank you.
If we might be able to switch to my computer. So here's the list of goals, the goal and object and consequent subsequent objectives for chapter 5, the historic, cultural, and scenic chapter of the comp plan. In the comp plan, the essence of this chapter boils down to and focuses on the identity of Albemarle County. It's grounded in what we came from and projects forward to our best version. In the context of this discussion, we thought it would be helpful to see the objectives as bullet points of the core ideas so that we can identify what's important and what's missing at a high level. So during the discussion, just keep in mind that the comp plan is a visionary document and it's also a roadmap to get there. So at this point, we've given you 3 questions to think about. Is this the right goal? Is this list still relevant? And is there anything to add?
You've also got at your places a printout of the goal and objectives from actually, it's more than no, it's chapter 5, which you've got there. And with the strategies, we're not really getting into that level of detail today, but sometimes those objectives make a little more sense if you see what was the other text that goes with it. So I'm not sure how you would like to proceed, but I think it'd be sort of informal and just whatever thoughts and comments or questions that you might have.
All right, well, thanks a lot. I guess we could start with objective 1. I guess my comment is it does seem like the right goal. I recently found out that in conjunction with a project we were looking at, that there was currently not a mechanism for gaining approval to take down a historic structure unless it was, I guess, individually protected, which surprised me. And so I think that would represent a more hurdles for potential applicants. I think in general, if want to preserve the character of the county, then there should be some kind of mechanism or some kind of default. What's worth preserving should be preserved, and at least kind of establish some kind of review process for that.
Thanks.
That's a great point. I was just looking at the goal and just curious if you considered using the word natural or scenic, or I think scenic refers to built landscapes as well as natural landscapes. But I think maybe there's room for natural, or maybe you guys considered it and didn't use it. That was one thought. And then the second sentence in the goal, should we tie that back to identity? and the reason, is preserving that identity or conveying that identity, that our uniqueness, why we are Albemarle County. Two initial thoughts.
Yeah, I think adding to what Frank observed, I feel like building on our the survey we've been doing of the entrance corridors, and more recently, as I think we're starting to recognize that really the rural character of so many of them is fundamental to the character of the county. And so I appreciate you suggesting adding natural or other things to emphasize landscape, even more than structures perhaps. And I think there are a lot of objectives that align with that in terms of the ones about visual quality of roadways, entrance corridors, streams, views. There might be a way maybe to further emphasize or bind that as like a key resource of the county that we want to be protected, preserved in the future. And I wasn't sure related to that, whether under objective 2, the protection programs and incentives. I can certainly imagine incentive programs in terms of protection programs. Would that include county ordinances such as like zoning and other things, or? Okay, great. Because I think at least for my part, I would encourage out of that objective thinking and perhaps implementing, just as Chris was suggesting about historic structures, introducing some requirements that would establish some defense of landscape character along the corridors.
Thanks.
I don't know whether we ultimately become the landscape and architecture review board, and we need more landscape architects like Frank, but
Landscape is a big portion of the guidelines.
yes, it is. Yeah, it's hiding under the title of the board.
I guess getting to question 2, whether or not the list is still relevant. In my opinion, it's still relevant. Nothing really jumped out at me that it seemed like it was out of date or not still relevant at this point.
I agree.
I agree as well.
And then as far as question 3, if there was anything to add, to me, it seemed like there were no glaring gaps in that list, but sometimes I have a harder time seeing an omission or identifying an omission than it's something that's there that I don't agree with. So else has any thoughts about additional goals?
Maybe just a question back to what you started with, Chris, about protection. Is it easy enough to give an overview of like what's protected and how it's protected? Or is that something I need to do my homework on? Just curious. Is it like, oh, it's a listed property?
There are no regulations to protect buildings or sites of historic importance.
That's really interesting. And I don't think, like you mentioned, I think it might be news to a lot of people.
All right, separate from national listing, right?
The listing in the national and state registers has no protection.
Oh, really? Okay.
No. And just curious if you, in looking at that, I know, Margaret, you've been involved with historic resources in the county. Are there other like county level, like peer counties or other counties in Virginia that have restrictions in place that, yeah?
Yep, absolutely.
Has it come up been voted down, or like, has it gone through the?
It's
vetting process?
never gotten as far as the Board of Supervisors for a vote. Back in 2000, the county's historic preservation plan was adopted. That process started as a plan, a historic preservation plan and ordinance. But as that work progressed, the committee that was working on it realized that really the plan needed to precede any regulations associated with it. So the plan moved forward and it was adopted in 2000. When that was done, the Board of Supervisors at the time directed the committee to focus efforts on educational and incentive measures, and that's what the committee has been doing since. There is a recommendation in the plan to consider a historic preservation ordinance, but that work on that has never gotten back underway.
Is it staff's like, and not policy, that's probably not the right word, but to ask an applicant that's planning to demolish a historic building to document it? I feel like I've seen that, but it's not a requirement to even document it.
It is one of the policies of the Historic Preservation Committee, and Chris is very much involved in working with the Historic Preservation Committee to do that. It's not a requirement. We ask the applicants for permission to have either staff or a committee member document the property. Often they agree, sometimes they do not.
Okay. Thank you. That's
Maybe
super helpful.
that is helpful. I don't know if that means that maybe if I might suggest that if objective 2 said protection regulations, programs and incentives, what I think I'm hearing, there might be some consensus that might be necessary.
It's interesting. And was it 50 years? What is like
40.
Well, 50 years is often the typical cutoff for something to be considered old enough to be considered historically significant, but not all localities do that. Sometimes it's less. Something that's really important could be a lot younger than that.
And so the State Department of Historic Resources only has authority over state resources, or does it cover all archaeological and historic resources?
A hard question to answer the way you've
Okay.
asked it.
Yeah.
They protect the listing, right? Like the National Register, and then they also implement the historic tax credit piece.
That's true. And that's where requirements come in
Okay.
for that process.
Got it.
But even with that, that even has a limited amount of time associated with it.
It's really interesting.
If a locality has a local historic preservation ordinance, then they can become what's called a certified local government, and you can become eligible for funding that does come through the State Historic Preservation Office for things like survey and other preservation related projects.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
right.
certainly.
Good afternoon, Neil Williamson with the Free Enterprise Forum. I appreciate this discussion and have a question. As you look at the objectives and we're considering honing down and trying to make these more accessible. Objective 10 speaks of visual quality of important views, which is fine. But objective 5 picks out one property owner, private property owner, and gives them powers according to the comp plan. I know of one planning commissioner that raises this on a regular basis as an issue. I would suggest that 05 could be rolled into 010 without significant loss in meaning, and perhaps bringing all properties into the same realm. Just an idea. Thanks.
Thank you.
Other comments, suggestions, questions?
One observation I had, this is, it's not, was just about the graphic for the comp plan. It kind of suggests residential development across the entire landscape. And so I wasn't, it's a standard image, but I wasn't sure if maybe slight tweaking of that to reflect maybe areas of greater concentration and some areas of total undevelopment might convey the sense of what we're talking about here a little bit.
Well, I drew the graphic,
Well, it's a lovely graphic.
so I can explain.
Okay.
It has 3 levels to it. If you get to look at the full version of it, the first level is people doing different activities in rural areas. You'll see a 4-board fence that's black. And then it gets more urban in the last thing, so from left to right, it goes from rural to
Okay.
urban.
Okay.
And so the emblem is actually on the more urban side, so
Okay.
it masks the commercial development. So the first layer is pedestrian and people. The second layer is residential, moving from residential forms to urban residential forms. And then the third level is commercial, so it goes from farming to UVA and kind of a downtown feel.
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you, Mariah.
Nice work.
So sorry.
Multi-talented.
Other comments?
I don't have any more comments.
No,
If you, after you leave, if you realize that there's something you should have said, please just email us.
all right.
Ben, do
Thank
you
you.
think we've got what we need for now? Anything more?
Yeah, I appreciate your feedback. This is exactly what we were looking for. As Margaret said, if you'd like to submit additional comments, I would just recommend you email Chris or Margaret, and that'll be relayed to us. I also wanted to mention that we, going back to the survey, we published some topic reports. Those are still available on our website. I thought the one that was produced for resources was very good. A lot of the content was provided by Margaret and Chris, and then also Scott Clark regarding natural resources. One of the trends that we identified was this protection of historic resources. How we currently identify them, but there's not really any teeth or regulation behind protection. So there's a chart in there that kind of shows demolition trends and how some of these are documented, some are not. So I think with even just providing documentation, there's room for improvement there. But if you want to go back and look at that report, I think it helps give a good primer for, the kind of content that we need to address in this new version of the plan.
Okay.
Thank you.
If y'all are interested in that, we can send you the link.
Mhm.
Get there
That'd be great.
quickly.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
Actually, as a last question, if you were to prioritize these, what would be your top 3?
Number 8 would be number 1 for me.
Well, that is helpful because the way the goal is written, entrance corridors is second. So
That was close.
it is helpful.
I guess for me, it would be number 2, protection programs and incentives. And I like incentives more than, regulations. So that would be my top one. Any of the other ones I think are important. And number 8.
I like 6 too.
I guess as I'm thinking about it, in some ways, in terms of thinking about what Neil said about how things could be condensed, I think if there were a way that maybe landscape could be emphasized as an overriding sort of asset and element to be preserved and sustained, and one that would support ultimately the visual quality of a lot of places, view sheds of lots of places, and could also help in terms of sustaining landscapes and environmental elements that would improve the visual quality of our stream. So it's so I guess that's not one of the objectives, but maybe one overarching that might bind them all.
That's helpful. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks a lot. On to our second work session, which is on the entrance corridor design guidelines addenda.
Hello, everyone. I'll be presenting this portion as always. And thank you again for your continued work and review of the corridors. Today we'll be reviewing the draft addenda, entrance corridor addenda for Route 742. This route is one of those that was recently designated as an arterial road by VDOT and thus enabling the entrance corridor guideline designation and application. So Route 742 is locally known as Avon Street Extended. It runs between Route 20 North to the city line at Morris Creek. Overall, this corridor is characterized by distant mountain views to the east and then to the west as you travel north along the roadway. Area zoning is primarily a mix of residential districts with pockets of light industry towards the south and PDSC planned development shopping center near Mill Creek Drive. And this is the precedent image for the corridor. The top row focuses on frontage conditions, the next set of images on the distant views that are available, and then building forms and examples at the end. This corridor was not broken up into segments, so we just have the corridor sheet containing all of the information. It's a relatively short corridor at 2.7 miles. I can flip between slides as needed.
Well, I guess we'll just go through one round of questions and comments and then pick up discussion from there. Frank, do you have any questions or comments?
Just a comment or two. Well done. Looks good. The
you.
Avinity townhomes that front this road are super interesting. You have a good image of those. Just in this context with a lot of like the single family detached residential back up on the other side. But then I think right next to this is the elementary school. Is that right? Like right there. But I feel like that we'll probably see applications that look like that in the future, and knowing that we have that example is helpful to think through. And it is nice how kind of you are pretty elevated up by the Food Line Shopping Center and stuff, and some really distant views west, I think, and as you mentioned, some views east. Then this, I think, didn't we review? I'm trying to remember. We've reviewed a couple applications like down near the Wegmans back entrance.
Caliber collision.
Yeah. Or maybe one that wasn't built.
I don't think the
remember.
caliber, as I recall, it's not one that's worth. Calibrating.
But yeah, just remembering back what we've looked at on this corridor, but thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Do you have any questions or comments?
No other comments, but thank you, Mariah, for the continued great work.
All right, thanks. And I guess my only comment, it seems appropriate to me to just have this as one segment, given the shortness of the corridor, and kind of picking up on what Frank said. I think the Avinity picture is great, because I think in the future, there's gonna be more of that, I think, not just on this corridor, but like on a lot of the entrance corridors. So that's a good example of, what a future applicant could look to as something that would headlines.
Thank you. Thanks.
All right, I guess we will move on to other business. First is approval of the March 6th, 2023 minutes.
I'll move to approve those.
Second.
All right, thanks.
Okay, Mr. Henningsen,
Aye.
Mr. Hancock,
Aye.
Mr. Vanderwerf.
Aye.
Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot. Are there any additional items that any board members or staff would like to bring forward?
One question. Oh, I guess that's the next item. The question mark on our next meeting. Okay.
Yes, so the next meeting is scheduled for April 3rd, 2023. There are no regular review items. I, for one, will not be in town for that.
I will also be away.
With that meeting. So would we want to just put the next meeting off until the 17th, consider
We won't be
regular review item?
deferring any business here.
Works for me.
Yeah, without any regular review items, I would recommend just waiting until April 17th.
Yeah. All right. That sounds good to me too. So in that case, this meeting is adjourned until our next meeting on April 17th. And by my watch, it is 2:16 PM. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.